Hello, everyone. Welcome. We will wait just another minute or so to allow folks to trickle in, and then we will get started with our presentations. In the meantime, though, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, where you're calling in from, and yeah, we'll get started in just a moment. Alrighty, we can go ahead and get started with an introduction. Yeah, welcome everyone to today's webinar on how states can engage in regional transmission planning using MISO's long-range transmission planning as a case study. And yes, this is the third in our transmission-focused series, which I will talk about more just in a moment. But yeah, thank you for introducing yourself in the chat. Feel free to continue doing so, and we can move on to the next slide with a bit of an introduction. So if it's your first time, my name is Kristen Suarez. My pronouns are she, they. I'm the State Climate Policy Network Manager here at Climate Exchange. You can learn more about our work at climate-exchange.org/network, which I just sent in the chat. On the next slide, just a little bit of an intro to us at CXC. Climate Exchange is a national organization focused on passing effective and equitable policy at the state level when it comes to climate mitigation policy. And the SCPN, or the State Climate Policy Network, is one of our main national programs for supporting that state work. We're a network of over 15,000 advocates, legislators, researchers, government officials, all sorts of folks working in and around state level climate policy across all 50 states. And if this is your first time engaging with the SCPN, I sent the link there in the chat. You can check us out a little more. It'll lead you to recordings and recap articles from past webinars, and as well as invites to future events and some other work that we do. Through all of our events, through all of our offerings, we really hope to create a space for state climate policy actors to connect with each other and really learn from the vast knowledge and experience held within the broader climate policy community. You can go to the next slide. And the last thing I'll note is just a couple ways we can support you in your work, or we can connect you to somebody who can. And feel free to reach out to me at kristen@climateexchange.org if you would like to learn more about this. But we have a pro bono policy assistance program. We specialize in tracking and analyzing state climate policy, as well as providing connections to experts, advocates, or other actors working on similar issues to you. What I always say is someone somewhere has done what you're trying to do. And so the SCPN really tries to connect you with those folks. We also host the State Climate Policy Dashboard, which tracks over 60 different types of climate policy as enacted at the state level across all 50 states, across all major climate sectors. So that's us. We can move to the next slide. We've invited an amazing panel of speakers today to talk about state engagement with regional transmission processes, specifically looking at MISO's LRTP as a case study. Before I get into the agenda for today, just a logistical note, feel free to use the chat box as a space for connection, sharing resources. But if you have any topic-related questions for the panelists, you can submit those at any time through the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your screen, so that we can speakers can look at them and answer. And this webinar is being recorded, as are all of our events. So if you have to hop off at any time, don't worry. We'll be sending the recordings, the recording slides, and recap article to you via email by the end of the week. And yeah, so today we're looking at MISO's LRTP process. This is a part of our transmission series. I'll send the link to that series in the chat, where we're working to educate the network on how and why transmission is an essential piece of state climate policy work. In past webinars, we've looked at why transmission is important, not only for climate, but for energy affordability, grid reliability, all those wonderful things. And we've also looked at what policy levers states can pull to advance transmission modernization and expansion. And of course, while there are many tools in the state toolbox to advance transmission related issues, Much of transmission is regulated at the federal and regional levels, and so it's essential for state actors to really understand what state engagement with regional processes looks like. Of course, that's going to be different in different RTOs and different regions of the country, but today we're just going to take a peek at MISO to shed some light at what's worked and not worked there. And today we have an amazing panel of speakers. We've invited Matt Prorock and Benjamin Stafford from GPI, the Great Plains Institute, as well as Beth Soholt, ED of the Clean Grid Alliance, and Andy Kowalczyk from the Southern Renewable Energy Association. And we'll start by kind of setting the stage with what transmission and RTOs kind of are all about. Then dive into MISO's LRTP case study, some lessons learned from some other stakeholders on the call, and then we will get into Q&A. So I will hand it over to you, Matt. Thank you so much for being here.
All right, thank you so much for having me and for having this panel. We're very excited about this and really glad to be here with the group and have the chance to talk about the successes and maybe some ongoing challenges that persist in the transmission planning space. I'm going to share my screen. Can you confirm that you can see my first slide?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. Okay. Well, let's dive in. So we kind of already hit this up. I can skip the agenda. We're going to talk about the role of states. We're going to talk about RTOs. We're going to engage with you and want to have lots of good discussion. I want to start just by welcoming my co-panelists and giving them a few moments to introduce themselves. So why don't we start with Beth, then we can go to Andy and then Benjamin, and then I'll wrap it up and take us back into the rest of the presentation. So Beth, if you don't mind just kicking us off with who you are, your organization, and a little bit about the perspective that you're bringing to the conversation today.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Glad to be here and thanks for the invitation. Beth Soholt, Executive Director of Clean Grid Alliance. We are a clean energy advocacy organization based in the Midwest. We work in 9 states and in the MISO footprint. We've been around for about 24 years and have really worked all of those years on transmission in MISO, setting the ground rules for things that need to happen at MISO to move the clean energy economy and transition forward. But we also work at the state legislative level. We do regulatory dockets. We do some very specific things around siting renewables in communities, finding grooming champions, and communicate about it all. And so we have a team of about 16, and we cover a lot of ground. So looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Beth. Andy, same thing to you. Who are you with? Give us a little bit of your background and kind of the perspective you're bringing to the conversation today.
Yeah, sure thing. And thanks again for the invite to be a part of this wonderful panel. My name is Andy Kowalczyk. I'm the transmission director for Southern Renewable Energy Association. I work out of New Orleans, Louisiana. And the Southern Renewable Energy Association is kind of like CGA, our southern counterparts in the MISO footprint that is a trade association. We represent a similar membership of energy storage, solar, wind, and transmission developers throughout MISO. And we have similar focus areas. We cover transmission planning, cost allocation, interconnection, the full suite of MISO stakeholder meetings, pretty much. And we also cover non-market areas in the Southeast too. So we cover Georgia Power territory, Southern Company, TVA, as well as Duke territory out there. So we bring the perspective of, non-market areas and kind of that reliability planning paradigm, as well as, engaging in MISO and their very, concerted attention to multi-value planning that's happening through LRTP. And we've been engaged in MISO for probably about the last decade or so. And we are a team of 4. We do legislative work on the state level. We also do state regulatory work. And then we do the RTO stuff that can be, cover everything in between, the regional stuff, the state level stuff that is concerned with things like cost allocation, and the stuff that goes all the way up to FERC with filings like Order 1920. So thanks for having me again.
Thanks, Andy. Benjamin, do you want to I'll say a little bit about GPI maybe, but if you want to introduce yourself and then I can jump into some of that.
Sure. Thanks, Matt, and thanks to the rest of the panelists and everybody in attendance today. Benjamin Stafford, I'm also with the Great Plains Institute, which Matt will illuminate in a moment. We sit in a team, and there's sort of one of 5 business lines within Great Plains Institute, all working on decarbonization issues, and we're in the energy systems team. My background, how I come to these issues, I've spent I'm dating myself here, a little over 20 years in industry in a variety of roles. Started as a state utility regulator, then went into academia, did some boutique consulting for the environmental sector as they considered RTO engagement. Studied them in academia, and it did some work on RTOs and ISOs in academia as well, and then worked for some trade groups. Prior to joining GPI, I was also a consultant to investor-owned utilities on these issues as well. So looking forward to the conversation today and where we go together. Thanks.
Thank you, Benjamin. And I'll round it out with less experience than these folks, but nonetheless, been in the game for about a decade here, working on MISO transmission at GPI. And as Benjamin said, we've got a whole team of folks. We've been in the transmission space for a number of years that predates my time at the organization, and really kind of got our start in the history that we're going to talk about here just momentarily. So let me press forward here. Just a brief word on GPI and kind of who we are. Our mission is to accelerate the transition to a net zero carbon emission economy in a way that benefits people, planet, and the economy. And I didn't say that in the way that it's written on this page, but the message is the same. We really look at this kind of triple-legged stool, if you will. The system needs to provide benefit to people. It needs to support a thriving economy, and it needs to minimize burden and impact on the environment as we do so. We've been around in this space for over 20 years. When I started 10 years ago, we were an organization of 10. Now we have over 60 folks, and we work across all major sectors of the economy: transportation, electricity, industry, buildings, agriculture, and forestry. And we try to do this work largely through convening, consensus building, forming partnerships, trying to find ways to move productive conversations forward. So thank you for having us here. This is exactly the type of space that we like to be in. We like to have productive conversation and share things out so others can maybe learn from what we've been through. So with that out of the way, let's dive into transmission. And I want to start first with, why should we care about transmission, and why do folks who care about climate or the other benefits that we ascribe to, why should you care about transmission? Well, transmission is critical for this future clean, reliable, and affordable electric system. It is what knits us all together. It is the system that allows optionality and provides folks with choices. The transmission system can be thought of kind of as the modern day market platform. We live in an increasingly interconnected world, and the more that we can trade and share resources, the more money we can save, and ultimately the more clean energy we can bring online, and the closer we can get to that triple goal of an affordable, reliable, and clean electric system. There's a lot of policy drivers that go into transmission planning and become part of the conversation as we plan transmission. All states have different types of policies. So some states have clean energy policies with very prescriptive or clearly laid out targets around generation mixes or generation portfolios. Other states have economic development goals or want to bring manufacturing into their state or attract new loads onto their system. All of these things depend on the transmission system to be available and of sufficient capacity to enable those things to take place. So as we see growing loads, as we see an evolving resource mix, the role of transmission it becomes increasingly important. Here's a quick little visualization of what this network looks like, and you can see it does truly tie us all together, but not all equally. So what you see today, I mean, this is the result of 100 years of investment by many different utility companies across the country, and the key thing I want to kind of point out at this point, if you look on the East Coast, you see it's denser. There's more development. For the last 100 years, as these projects have been built, the technology has also evolved. The business models have evolved. Some of the regulation has evolved that have driven more regionalization, more sharing, and interconnection. But this is all still pretty much predicated on, I need to build a power plant. I'm going to put it kind of close to where my load centers are, and then I'm going to connect with my neighbors in a marginal way to share. That is what is fundamentally changing today. As we go toward a system that relies much more significantly on remote resources and on sharing resources and on resources that are variable because they're dependent on the availability of wind or solar, right, or just other resources, this interconnectedness becomes much more important. And I want to illustrate that with a story. So let's take a step back a long time now to 2008 and 2009 when the states across the Midwest, and at this time, MISO was only what you see on the screen here. There was no MISO South yet. So at this time in the 2008 timeframe, the states in the upper Midwest, not all of them, but many of them began putting in place renewable portfolio standards. And the utilities started wondering how they were going to meet those requirements and started getting together and talking about regional approaches. With the idea that can you make this investment? Can you meet this target objective in the most affordable way that we can? And what they came up with was what you see here on the screen, the multi-value project portfolio. This is a set of 17 transmission projects designed to move power from west to east, so from the west where the greatest potential wind resources are, to the load centers that are on the eastern portion of MISO, Chicago, Detroit, and elsewhere to the East Coast. These were approved in 2011 with a lot of work from Beth and the states, and we'll get into all of that. But they were put in place, they were approved in 2011, began construction shortly thereafter, and by 2020, all but one of these projects was built. And this was really the first example, or maybe the best example that we had seen in the country at that time, and until recently had remained so. So these MVP projects are critical for enabling the policy objectives of a variety of states in a more efficient way than they could have done it, a lower cost way than they could have done it had they done it on their own. And then February 2022 happened, and this is my fun part of the story where I get to tell you that when the coldest day of the year, maybe of the decade, was happening across large swaths of the country, I was in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in a yurt in the woods, not paying attention to anything. It was cold, but we had a wood stove, so we were okay. But I came out, of that and got back into cell service, and I logged on to Twitter and I saw, oh wow, MISO's in a grid emergency. Oh wow, SPP's also in a grid emergency. Oh wow, ERCOT is really in a grid emergency. And that was scary for me. I mean, because that doesn't happen every day. What happened? What did we see? Well, we saw 5 to 6 days. So not just a brief blip of cold weather, but persistent extreme cold weather across large geographic areas. And what did that do? It put tremendous stress on the grid itself. It put stress on the fuel delivery systems that deliver fuel to power plants. It also increased the load across the system as people were heating their homes. It stressed the transmission system and the power generation resources to be able to keep up. And we saw catastrophic failure in several parts of the country. ERCOT had to shut their grid down to prevent it from really breaking and not being able to be brought back online for a very long time. And part of why that had to happen was because they did not have the transmission connectivity to their neighbors that other parts of the country did. Conversely, in the Southwest Power Pool, which is just to our west, it's kind of the Plains region, where you can see really the darkest color in this map, we were able to move 13,000 megawatts of power from PJM on the East Coast, where these cold temperatures were not affecting the system to the same degree, and wheel that power, in large part because of the MISO multi-value projects, wheel that power west into SPP and help keep the lights on in parts of MISO and in parts of SPP. And the story is transmission provides optionality, it provides resilience, and it provides insurance. These projects were not designed to move power east to west, right? They were designed to move the wind power west to east. But on the really bad day, the RTOs were able to coordinate and rely on their infrastructure to save lives. That's the story of transmission. And that's why it's frankly so critical. It's not just decarbonization, but the whole future of the system, as it's going to have to deal with more dynamic change. That leads us to RTOs. These are the folks who are responsible for planning the transmission system and operating the transmission system. And as we've been discussing and kind of teeing up, and now we're going to get into, these are the venues that are critical for states and for other folks to get involved in the conversation. What are these RTOs? Regional transmission organizations, also sometimes called independent system operators. I'm sure Benjamin can help you thoroughly understand the difference between the two. But they cover much of the country and really support delivery of the vast majority of electricity that's consumed across the United States. About 70% of energy, or excuse me, electricity that is used is delivered through these regional transmission organizations. GPI in our history has looked at three of the largest ones and have active work engaged in three of the largest ones: the Southwest Power Pool, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, and to our east, PJM. These RTOs have complex stakeholder processes. So we just have a couple samples here of what the structure of those stakeholder processes look like. Multiple committees where ideas have to be introduced, then taken up, then debated, then voted upon, then moved on to another group to be introduced, discussed, debated, and voted upon. And ultimately, in MISO, it results in votes from various stakeholders to express opinions to MISO. By and large, or maybe entirely, those votes are advisory, so they guide MISO, but they do not necessarily bind the decision making of MISO. But it is the formalized process and voice that stakeholders have. And so now I want to get into what that actually means, what it looks like in practice. RTO governance, politics, and culture all play a role in how decisions are made and ultimately what transmission plan emerges from these regional processes. On the right-hand side of this slide, you can kind of see who's at the table. So bear with me for a moment. Let me just walk through this really quickly. We have IPPs, which are independent power producers. That's the folks that Beth and Andy represent with their organizations. You also have TDUs, or transmission dependent utilities. Those are utilities that serve load but don't own transmission. Consumer advocates, environmental advocates, transmission owners. Those are your large utilities who do own the transmission system. There's a real key distinction there, right? Also, we'll get into that around the politics and the power dynamics of, do you own the assets or not? Are you dependent on them? You got power marketers and folks who are really engaged in the market side of things. The state regulatory authorities playing a critical role. Notice they have the greatest number of votes within this advisory committee structure here of any single sector. And then you've got a couple of end-use customers and transmission developers. I didn't mention the affiliate sector. The affiliate sector is also one that has industry representative groups.
Matt, if you want to back up, yeah, I was say back up
please.
one slide, because I'm gonna give a sneak preview of this. So this eye test chart is showing how differently these regional transmission organizations get their expertise together to make decisions. So when we think about advocacy, which we'll get into in just a moment, you have to think about, where do I show up, and how is the stakeholder experience framed? How are stakeholders led to the decision-making process to be helpful? One of the interesting parts of this area of the economy is that you need the expertise of the regulated, or those that would benefit from these markets, in order to effectively regulate them. There has to be a really meaningful exchange of this. I think I've been involved in every stakeholder process short of ERCOT, in the domestic map of RTOs and ISOs, and all of them are trying to solve a lot of the same problems. They organize differently around some of these cultural elements that Matt talked about. So that's why these boxes and these charts look different. There was not, when RTOs and ISOs were stood up to help ferret all these decisions, which are really important, they were not given a specific way they had to organize, and that was by definition with FERC. And to have them be able to absorb some of the expertise they already had at their time, because a lot of them were already doing a lot of this work, so they didn't want to prescribe this. But what you've seen is, as the issues have evolved and as membership in RTOs and ISOs have evolved, we've seen much different shapes take place, and that affects what an advocate can do in all these spaces. So that's just to give you a sneak preview of where we might be headed.
Thank you, Benjamin. And I'm actually going to use this as a nice segue to call on Beth and Andy here and talk a little bit more about kind of exactly that, the stakeholder process, the political dynamics. And, I'll open it up for either of you to chime in first, but I would love to just kind of hear how you think about the formalized voting process and structure within MISO, but then also, like, how is MISO actually influenced? How does that decision making and that influence actually play out in kind of a real world, both informal and formalized process perspective?
Sure. Thanks for the question. So I think that there are a couple ways. First, it's like anything else. You have to have relationships with the people who are making decisions, who are key staff, who are heads of these other sectors that you see around the wheel here. As far as voting, MISO does not take a whole lot of votes on things. We used to do that a lot more, but it is more kind of presentation and comment. We do a lot of comments as a sector. Where both Andy and I are part of the environmental sector, um, and MISO puts out for comment almost after every major stakeholder committee meeting or subcommittee. A set of issues that we have a chance to weigh in on. And it really lets us take a deep dive into the things that matter to us and make sure that stakeholders understand. They post those comments publicly on MISO's website so that it's very transparent. I would say the um, other key folks in MISO are the board of directors. We have worked over the years to get more time with the board. We do quarterly, we do kind of a hot topic that's of importance to the sectors, where we get, 90 minutes to discuss an issue with the board of directors. Probably in looking at the layers in MISO, the there's kind of a management level that are kind of the doers. There's senior management, there's the board, there's the stakeholders. Um, and I'd say those day-to-day managers who are doing the work are really important. But so are the senior manager level who are basically making the decisions to try to knit together all these very different sector opinions. And then finally, I guess I would say some of the sectors, transmission owners and the state regulators really carry more weight than other sectors. Now, MISO probably wouldn't like me saying that, but the reality is MISO works very closely with the state regulators because they have they have two sides of the coin to a job to ensure cost-effective electricity and reliable electricity. Transmission owners are the ones making a lot of the investments, and so they're very economically driven and have that kind of interest. So you get to know what each sector's interests are and about how you can create partnerships and what do you need to move the ball forward? Who do you have to convince? So just a couple observations.
Thanks, Andy. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, the only thing I'll add to that too is like you said, Beth, that transmission owners and regulators are incredibly, they carry a lot of weight in MISO. And a lot is dependent on the transmission owners in terms of the system, and that dynamic can be really challenging, like in a place where the regulators may be dependent on the transmission owners to make them look good to their constituents. It's something that we see playing out in a place like Louisiana, where it is an elected body for the Public Service Commission. So I think that there's maybe not the best interplay between regulators and who they regulate, where they are being convinced of what course of action to take on grid planning by their transmission owner that they're themselves trying to regulate, which can be a challenge to MISO's goals of long-term planning for affordability and a more competitive energy mix. So it's something that's an ongoing thing, an ongoing issue. And then I'll just add also that, the advisory votes, in my opinion, and some of the comments, that's a way of understanding as a stakeholder, and maybe even for MISO to understand who might be litigating things after the fact too, because I do see that that's kind of a bellwether early on. You're like, oh, this person's going to do a FERC filing or challenge something.
Yeah, that's a really important point, Matt. I would just say that, the stakeholder process is one thing, but the ultimate arbiter is FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And so sometimes we know, okay, this is a tariff filing, MISO has to make this. Our ultimate audience is going to be FERC or the courts if people appeal it up, to a circuit court. So we think about what do we need in the record? What do we need in our comments? What do we need to have to make the case for the outcome that we want? So sometimes we back calculate, knowing this is going to go to FERC and this is what we need to do to make our case.
I think just as one last note for our audience, because I know that this is a geographically dispersed audience, is your RTO or ISO may not look at this, but this way of thinking that Beth and Andy are laying out is consistent. Just as a quick anecdote, the votes in PJM don't work the same way as they do. They're actual like property right votes in PJM. California ISO does not actually have a formal stakeholder process. They have sort of a call and response where the staff of the ISO put out proposals and they go back and forth. New York is a single state ISO and they are very beholden to some of their state agencies. This may look different where you live, but the logic pattern that Beth and Andy laid out of like you got to strategize, you got to know who's influential in where to go, which is a preview of where we're going to go. Spoiler alert, folks. You want to have that way of thinking. We'll use MISO really for a lot of today, but where you live and where your footprint is and where you may advocate on the state level may look slightly different.
Thank you. And what a wonderful segue into talking about long range transmission planning. So let's dive in. So we already talked about some of the history of the multi-value projects, and I said that those had culminated with approval in 2011, and then they, were in construction and in service into the 2020s. Once the projects are approved from a MISO perspective, that process is done. They're gonna direct those projects to go be built. The utilities, maybe bid out through a competitive process, or an incumbent utility will build that project. But regardless, MISO kind of hands that off, and it's now into a state permitting and siting process. In the meantime, they begin turning the crank on the next round of planning. And so from 2012 through 2018, MISO underwent a lot of change. They added MISO South, which changes the generation mix of MISO and also the cultural makeup of MISO. We saw this dramatic increase over several years in interconnection requests, particularly starting in MISO West, where the wind resources are the best. But this has really, as costs have come down and as the technologies and the turbines have gotten bigger, we've seen this queue issue really spread across the entire or large portion of the MISO North footprint. And there were these multiple attempted rounds at another MVP. Beth might remember some of that. Andy, I don't know, maybe the first time we met was when I was down in New Orleans for a meeting for the Regional Transmission Overlay Study, or RTOS, where we all thought that was going to be the next big kind of planning study, and it went nowhere. And by and large, that was because there was lack of clear and consistent drivers of need across the region. But then in 2019, something started changing. We started seeing the emergence of utility clean energy goals or decarbonization plans, and also an increase or emergence of new state policies, right? So 2009 renewable portfolio standards, those were largely met in the mid 2010s. And then here we are today, and we didn't have policy driver, but that has begun to change as well. You saw several states implement clean energy policies. And as a result of all that, kind of around the same time in 2019, we saw MISO kick off what they eventually called the long range transmission planning process, and everything was underway. And I kind of want to open it up for the panel here for folks to share kind of what their observation of that process really looked like, right? It took 2019 was when MISO began updating their planning scenarios. They call them futures. But I can remember looking at this assumptions that were in those scenarios around 20 years of renewable generation expansion, really taking a step change once you saw these policies and these goals being incorporated, and ultimately that drove a conversation around the need for some robust long-term regional transmission planning. So I would love to just kind of open it up for some conversation. The result of this culminated in the projects actually getting planned and approved in August of 2022. We saw the first tranche of LRTP approved here with 17 projects, all of which are 345 kV, and really reinforced and created the what MISO termed the reliable achievement of a lot of the policy objectives that were amongst the stakeholders and the states and the utilities at that time. So yeah, let me open it up here for folks to chime in. What was your impression on this process? Do you agree with my characterization of years of kind of flailing and then an aha moment and crystallization, but still a lot of work? So give us some insight into what that looked like and what were key factors in your mind that actually enabled MISO to get this LRTP Tranche 1 done?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. It wasn't just policy drivers for clean energy, it was the economics of the falling prices of wind and solar and storage starting to be a reality. You had a lot of corporate buyers saying they wanted the product. And so there were some additional drivers, I think, that helped. Um, the main disappointment, though, is really we spent a decade flailing around, not really getting anything going. And not that MISO wasn't trying, but I think that they could have been a little bit stronger at times and directed, and they were afraid to potentially lose members if they were too strong. But the result really is, we have a resource adequacy issue as we try to add large load. If we had kept up with the curve a little bit more, we would maybe not be sitting where we are today. So we're always behind the eight ball as far as transmission goes. We can build clean energy generation much quicker than the transmission. So we had to get over that transmission fatigue from the multi-value project portfolio, from kind of trying and failing to do a number of starts, and then kind of take the coalition of the willing who is willing to look at another tranche. I think that's the other thing that MISO really did was if MISO South didn't want to come along, we're working on them now, but if they weren't willing yet to play ball, then we're going to take those who are willing to go ahead and plan the next tranche because the policies are different in some of the MISO North states from the MISO South states. And I think we also had strong leadership from some of our state regulators. More they came together more around futures that we were going to do the technical work around. And so we spent a lot of time looking at what are the bookends of what we are planning. And then I think that because the multi-value project cost allocation requires that there are broad benefits across the footprint, it lends itself to finding something in it for everyone, making sure the cost benefit is there for each state, each utility, each zone in the MISO footprint. So, and I think that there was just more of a groundswell of support from unusual places. People were really starting to figure out that transmission was the ticket. And like you said, Matt, at the beginning, gives you flexibility and optionality. And that there was no way we were going to be able to drive the kind of economy, drive the kind of manufacturing, drive the kind of development that we wanted to see in the Midwest without a significant increase in the transmission grid. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Beth. Andy, I'm going to come to you in just a second, but for the sake of time, I'm going to jump into our next slide, which is on Tranche 2, which is the continuation of the story, and still more planning in MISO North. And Beth, maybe you would characterize it this way, kind of a continuation of the momentum, would you say? Were there things that sort of fundamentally changed between Tranche 1 and Tranche 2.1 that we have today?
So I think what happened in some of the utilities was their appetite for clean energy got even stronger. Their requirements were increased. They have commission orders and resource plans that they have to meet, and we're still working on meeting those. And so the case just got stronger. And I think that for better or worse, utilities figured out, they needed to invest in transmission and that they could actually, rate base and do transmission and they were going to be okay. I think we started to have, Matt, you illustrated with some of the weather events. We started seeing real life issues of how important being able to send thousands of megawatts from really the East Coast across MISO to SPP, or, send thousands of megawatts long distances because we didn't have to shed as much load during those severe weather events. So I think some of those things really supported moving Tranche 2.1.
Thank you. Um, Andy, I want to kind of pull you into the conversation here. You represent a perspective of MISO South, which hasn't been on either LRTP map yet. So give us some insight into why that is, and what you think some of the hangups are, and how you're thinking about the future of long-range transmission planning. Are you expecting planning in MISO South? Has there been planning in MISO South in lieu of LRTP? Kind of help paint that picture for us.
I mean, I haven't remembered all the questions that you asked, but I'll just kind of touch on them out of order. The outreach to MISO South regulators, who, as we pointed out earlier in the presentation, are incredibly important to this process, especially as it relates to cost recovery for these transmission projects, hasn't been as successful as in the North. And I think a big reason for that is because they have hired consultants that end up going to MISO meetings, and they just don't prioritize this. And for whatever reason, MISO hasn't been able to really pull them in to the importance and the value of this sort of transmission planning. And while this has been happening with LRTP Tranche 2.1 and LRTP Tranche 1, there's been kind of a combative attitude, I think, on behalf of regulators, where they may perceive like multi-value planning as something that's just being pushed on them forcefully, even though, once a portfolio is approved, all these lines and all these projects go through state processes to get regulator approval. That perception is still out there, I think, amongst a lot of regulators. And for whatever reason, I think that MISO just hasn't been successful in talking about the benefits more than the costs. So what gets through to a lot of the Southern regulators is that this will cost billions of dollars. And that's the first thing that they hear. And they immediately turn away from it before they can hear that it's going to come with tens of billions of dollars of benefits to consumers over the next 20 years or so. And I do think that there's differing priorities, but I think what a shared common denominator amongst all regulators, like Public Service Commission regulators, is that it's in their mission to provide affordable rates for electricity, and that this is a huge benefit of these types of multi-value lines, providing a more diverse energy system that can draw on multiple resources, and having a more resilient system are two things that are really, really important in the state of Louisiana, where we get hit by extreme weather events. And it's something that we've continually advocated for, that this is an avenue, but we need to have MISO pick up that a lot more and be a lot more, have a more concerted program around that. And then I think one more on the issue of are there transmission plans happening in MISO South? Like a testament to, whether or not we need these lines, if there is a public policy goal in place, is that over the last 2 or 3 years in MISO South, there's been about $3 to $4 billion in proposed investments coming from Entergy. When you look at them on the map and you look at the size of them, they have regional impacts and they probably have regional benefits, but they're not getting the same process as LRTP where they actually account for those benefits. And then regulators can actually see that when they're making a decision about whether or not this is a good investment. So they're just kind of flying blind on these huge investments. But from an engineering standpoint, they still need them to keep the system running and reliable.
Benjamin, you
Matt,
want to?
yes, I might want to take a step back. So, I mean, Beth and Andy are giving great examples of what we talked about earlier, being the RTO governance, politics, and culture are really guiding this policy making. I think Beth pointed out very accurately that these trends are broad. They're not just within the territory of MISO. You've got this trend towards the clean energy being on the margin to replace resources being the most economic in most of in great amounts of the country, I should say. You have a pressure or you have a pressure on utilities. Sometimes they have their own clean energy goals. You have more than 75% of the Fortune 100 companies had some sort of clean energy goal or target. More than 53% of the U.S. population lives in a territory that has, carbon free by date certain goals by legislation or executive order. These trends are everywhere. And this individual use case, if tranche is not in part of your vocabulary where you live, it's totally fine. But there's going to be pressures like this across these regional transmission organizations. It's good to take a step back and say, what matters in your state? What's the voice of state advocacy where you sit? And how can you be most effective in pushing these objectives? And this is a great example of MISO, who, allegedly nationally is seen as doing this well. It's not easy. This is really challenging work.
Thank you, Benjamin. I'm just taking note of time, and we've got maybe 10, 15 minutes left. Happy to jump into questions from the chat or Q&A. I did see one and answered it, so thank you for that. I don't see any others, so I think we'll just keep going for now. Great. So Benjamin, you actually gave me a really nice segue into that this is happening not just in MISO, but in all over the country and really all over the world. So what comes next? Well, the next big thing is interregional transmission. And so we're talking about lines between MISO and SPP, or MISO and PJM, or other neighboring systems. And as we are in a world of increasing load, as we are in a world of more extreme, large-scale weather events, this connectivity, regional and then interregional, becomes even more important. Think of every challenge that Beth and Andy and Benjamin just talked about with the politics, and now make two regions that are distinctly different, have different cultures and different processes, get them to try to do it together. It's a real challenge. We have seen multiple attempts at interregional transmission planning studies turn up nothing. And part of that is because of the process, and a lot of it has to do with, as we've been getting into, regional differences and the politics. Really quickly, as I said, we're in an era of growing load. Data centers are large loads that are can come on quickly, but the scale to which I think is still a bit uncertain, and it is evolving as technology is changing. But we are also seeing other drivers of load growth, from electrification, from re-onshoring of manufacturing, that's been happening for a number of years. And also, as we've kind of talked about, this growing recognition of resilience, and there is an interesting emerging kind of planning approach that looks specifically at some extreme winter weather scenarios. I'll call out the Southwest Power Pool has integrated some scenarios specifically on extreme winter storms, looking at Winter Storm Uri and Winter Storm Elliott, and looking at how their system responded during those, and building scenarios around those to say, well, what system do we need for that really bad day? That is somewhat novel across the country, so we may see other regions adopt that type of practice as well. And then last but not least, not to go into it, and I'll leave this, and folks can read the slide afterward, but once you plan the lines, you have to build them. And so transmission siting is increasingly important. It's hard. These are linear projects that affect a lot of different people, and typically elicit public backlash. So that's another key piece of the puzzle. So that's what we've got in terms of the slides. I'm going to stop sharing and we'll open it one more time up for discussion. I'm going to check the Q&A here. Okay, so let me take this question from Gabriel, and then if we have time, we'll get to any last question that I had for the group. So to all the panelists, is there evidence that these new transmission lines are leading to lower costs for the average ratepayer? It seems like utility bills are going up across the country and that transmission projects are one of the primary reasons. When do these projects deliver economic benefits to the ratepayer? That's a great question, Gabriel. I'm really glad that you asked it. Who would like to take a first crack at that one?
I can.
Go for it, Beth.
Well, I'll give you my answer, and then I'm sure others have thoughts. So you have to imagine a scenario where you don't have the transmission, and if you need to add new generation, what would the cost of that new generation be? Or what would your cost of your choices of new generation be? The transmission we've built, enables multiple things, but one of the things is we take into consideration where the best renewable energy resources are located. So the transmission is allowing access to lowest cost new resources. So when I look at my transmission bill, I'm in Minnesota and Xcel Energy is serves about 50% of the state. There's three components to my bill: generation, distribution, and transmission. Transmission's about 12% of my bill. They actually break it out at Xcel. Distribution is I don't know, less than generation, but generation's maybe 49%. So distribution's the rest, and transmission's 12, so distribution is the rest. But the point is, transmission's not the big investment. The billions of dollars come when you make the generation choice. So your bill is lower than it would have been if a utility has to choose higher cost generation to serve load. That assumes a lot of things, but that's kind of how I look at it, as it would have been more, but you can't really see that. You see your bills going up because we're making investments in these infrastructure, in these large, long-lived infrastructure. But at some point it should level off, because if we invest in renewable energy, you're not going to have the same O&M costs. The fuel is free, so it's going to level off after you pay off the capital costs. So those are a couple of things that go into how we factor in and how we look at from a regulatory perspective. The regulators in regulated states are still looking to make sure these are prudent investments for ratepayers, but that's my take.
Thanks, Beth. Benjamin.
Yeah, and even in the states that are unbundled, or what I think is this is me being precise, probably too much, but I think deregulated is the term. That's not necessarily accurate. It's just a different form of regulation. But the states that have unbundled some of these services, like in the PJM footprint, they also have set offices in their state regulators to track whether those benefits are actually happening. So when Ohio chose to seed a lot of its generation to competitive resources at that level, they also required an office to monitor that and make sure it's actually delivering benefits. There's been studies about what's been coming online with the RPSs into those regional grids, as pretty much across the board lowering net costs. That doesn't mean that will stay there at all time, and it also depends on where you sit. I would also say if you sit in a constrained area, any transmission helps. And that is going to lower your transmission and your generation very low, pretty extremely. And interestingly enough, those high congestion points, those pain points in the grid, they're supposed to be expensive. Because they're supposed to attract new investment. So it's kind of built into this idea that, if you're more expensive where you sit, if transmission planning and investment is going right, that's supposed to help solve itself. But you need this advocacy, you need the objectives to come into place to make that happen. So to quote the Canadian philosopher Avril Lavigne, why'd you have to go and make things so complicated? That's the way RTOs and ISOs are, but in their intent, they should be attracting investment to the right places. Transmission lowers both the transmission portion of your bill and the generation portion of your bill if it's working well, and you need advocates to make sure it's working well.
Yeah, one more point to make here quickly is that not all transmission is the same. And I kind of showed that picture at first of the whole country and articulated that a lot of that was built kind of what I might call bottom up, or hey, I need to hook up a new power plant, or my neighbor's power plant has, some spare capacity. So if I run a small line together, we can share. But that's not the type of transmission that is needed to enable the type of transformation that we're talking today. And quite frankly, the business models and the regulatory constructs in some ways are set up to make it easier to plan and build the more localized transmission than it is to plan and build the regional and interregional transmission. And so, just to Benjamin's point, that you need advocates and states in this space to drive transparency and ensure that the planning is really driving the most value for customers across the region and across the country. Part of that is recognizing that what we need today isn't what we needed yesterday, and the results of planning need to acknowledge the trade-off. We do have limited dollars to invest overall in infrastructure. We should try to direct those dollars into the greatest value return that we can get from those investments. All right. I think I have time for maybe one more question to my panelists. So, what would your recommendation be to an advocate or a state representative or state commissioner or commission staff who's on the call today to make their engagement in their respective state or regional transmission planning process as effective as possible? Is there a specific strategy or something to focus on that you would recommend for them? So floor's open. I know that's kind of a tough one, but floor's open for that one thing that can make it all work.
Boy, that's a tough one because it really depends on where you sit, what resources you have to engage. But I guess, is there somebody that you can find that you trust to kind of educate you on these issues, to dip your toe into to the water? Is it a colleague? Is it, do you have to take a leap and cold call somebody who you've seen on these issues? But, find somebody who looks like a trusted advisor on these and pick their brain, or ask current advocates how they're doing it. Or, I mean, one thing you'll find in this industry, and probably in a lot of others, is we're all glad to talk about our work. And so, if you ask for a consultation with somebody about how are you doing this, or how'd you do this, or what are your thoughts, or whatever, I mean, we're all very open to doing that. So, you know, uh, you have to be able to sustain a presence in the stakeholder process for a while. This is, if you're just trying to dip in and out, that's very difficult.
Mhm.
Maybe you can follow one issue, but if you're really going to engage in a lot of different ones, you need to have some staying power and be able to go to meetings and participate in whatever feedback loop there is, establish those relationships. So, yeah, a couple thoughts. I'll turn it over to others.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think that for commissions and commission staff, uh, find regulators, fellow regulators, and fellow staff that are highly engaged and are fired up about these things. Because you'll get a lot better information and get some regulatory perspective too, to help in your journey of really understanding where you fit in and what your priorities are, how your state's priorities line up with efforts within the RTO. And maybe diversity too, trying to get more than just one perspective on things. Because I think that, and there may be even a tendency to do this within the environmental sector, although I think we check ourselves quite often with not trying to be too much of one thing rather than, getting a more fulsome kind of picture. I think we're really good at that, actually. But there are some stakeholders, I think, that kind of stick to one corner, and that's not good. So
Thanks, Andy. Benjamin, anything you want to add to wrap us up?
Yeah, it's a know we're at time. I mean, I think I couldn't agree more with the keep showing up, build relationships, because this really is a relationship business, and the committees evolve from relationships. The way the discussions evolve are from relationships, and you'd be surprised that like all of us showed up vulnerable to this at some point. And did not know what we were doing, and now we're trying to convince you we do know. We're running a webinar, but it's one of the things that we did when I was a state commission is when people showed up and they didn't know how we worked, the first thing we said was thank you. You're here, and that's what matters. And so keep showing up and find someone that says thank you for being here. I'd love to make sure that you're involved and that you're able to learn and your voice is heard. It's not easy. The vocab is specific, but you're not going to do that without being vulnerable.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I know we're right at time. I'm going to try to type a written answer to another one of these questions in the chat, but thank you again for the opportunity, and thank you to Beth and Andy for joining us, and Benjamin, as always. Kristen, back over to you. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much. I really appreciate you all being here. I really appreciate the candid kind of inside look at behind the scenes, like what is important, and the fact that those different partnerships, those different when you show up and how and where, I think are important, and shed a lot of light into some of us who are not as deep in the sector as you are. So I really appreciate that. I appreciate the answering of the questions. We are going to go ahead and wrap up here. Thank you all so much for your time, panelists and attendees alike. I know there are a million things that are firing on the energy and climate front right now, so I appreciate your time here. As usual, a recap article, recording, slides, all of those good things will be sent out hopefully by the end of this week, if not early next week. And yeah, feel free to reach out to me if you want connections to any of these lovely folks on the call to ask more questions of them, or see their insights in a different way. There's a poll that is launched right now. You can feel free to vote to let us know how this was useful for you. But yeah, thanks all for being here. Transmission is really important. It's one of those things that you're not going to see the immediate impacts of tomorrow, but is nonetheless extremely important to have, should have been done yesterday. So yeah, thank you all. Thank you for grounding us in the Avril Lavigne quote as well. But yeah, go forth with more transmission knowledge. Thanks everyone for your amazing work, and yeah, have a great rest of your week.
Thank you all. Thanks for
Thank
having
you.
us.
Alrighty.
Thanks, Beth. Thanks, Andy. See ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.